Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Amos Zweig and myself, we're back with a new video conversation. And the topic that we thought we could be discussing today, it's the topic of abusing authority. So in other words, the idea of someone having authority and the possibility of that authority being abused, being used against its purpose, and possible ways that can be, you could say, controlled, perhaps, how to relate to this possibility. This is an interesting topic, and it's always relevant because in politics, in society as a whole, in many different cases, there is the possibility of some position or power or authority being abused. So it's an interesting and relevant and practical question of how to deal with this. Amos and myself, we have had conversations previously where we have touched upon the nature of authority, the nature of power, and the relationship between those two concepts, and also ideas about government and resistance to government. And also we have compared different forms of government: monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, which also touches upon the question of abuse of authority and how to relate to this, because different forms of government might have different ways of relating to this problem. So, Amos, I suppose we could begin this conversation by, first of all, defining terms. Perhaps we could bring back some of the definitions that we touched upon in our previous conversations. For instance, a brief definition of authority and a brief definition of power, so that the audience have that as a foundation, and we have that as a foundation for this conversation.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, and I think that's a good idea to get these definitions back to memory as a start. So if I remember correctly, and you can of course then correct me if I miss something, we defined power in the broadest sense as the ability to make something happen. And we limited then specifically to the social context, that power would be the ability to make something happen in society. So a person who has power has the ability to make things happen in society in a way that he wishes. And we have defined authority as someone who is in a position of power or has a position of power, but uses, or this power has a certain purpose or is circumscribed by a certain purpose. And that purpose is always securing a common good of the members of society. And it is actually this common good which gives this person authority, which is a kind of positive form of power. And at the same time, this common good also limits the area in which the authority is. And then abuse of authority would be somehow to step outside of that area circumscribed by the common good.
Thank you, Amos. Yes, those are good points, definitions to consider, and a few examples that can be given. You might think of a teacher who has pupils and a classroom, teaches those pupils in a classroom. The authority of the teacher is based upon some common good, that is the pupils or the students being educated in some science or field of knowledge. And that also means that the purpose of the authority is to teach the students. So if the teacher began to do something completely unrelated to education altogether, that would be stepping outside of the boundaries of that authority that the teacher has. And here we also can find a good example of the idea of abuse of authority. If the teacher began to use his or her authority to do something completely unrelated to the education of the pupils and students, that would then be an abuse of authority. So perhaps then we can define the abuse of authority to employ or use one's position of authority or power in a way that contradicts its purpose, or at least goes outside of its purpose. It's a way of using some faculty or position or thing, position is perhaps the best word, of authority against its purpose. So in other words, you could talk of it as a perversion of a position, because what does perversion mean? It means to use something against its natural end or purpose. It's to distort something against its nature in a way. And that is something we could say about abuse of authority or power. What do you think about this?
Yes, I think that's a good definition of what abuse of authority would be, because the authority is distinguished from mere power by the fact that it is, and probably this is kind of by a social agreement or by a common intuition or understanding, that people altogether understand that this power has to be used in this manner to achieve the common good. And so the common good is what gives justification to the use of power. And we distinguish this by the special term authority. And therefore, when a person in a position of authority uses their power in a way that goes against the purpose for which they were put into this position or society agreed on, then they are abusing their authority. And I think your mentioning of perversion is actually a good reference, because perversion is to use something which has an actual purpose or a good in mind, but to use it in a different form or towards a different end.
Right. Yes, that's those are interesting points you brought up there. Now, I would put it somewhat differently when it comes to the grounding or foundation of there being positions of authority. I wouldn't so much talk of a social agreement, but rather that those positions of authority, legitimate power, is there because of there being some common good, that then that position is authorized to judge upon or have authority over. So it's, I wouldn't say it's necessarily because of an agreement, but rather that there are objectively certain goods that then have to be taken care of. So, but yes, with the rest of what you said, that I would agree to that. So then we realize, as people generally do, that when people are in positions of authority, they can abuse that authority. And of course, people realize that there is a distinction between using authority in the right manner and using authority in the wrong manner. And the wrong manner is, of course, to perverse it, to abuse it, in other words. And that's also a side note could be that that's a good point to use against certain, say, anarchists who might think that because many governments does a lot of bad things, even tyrannical and very wicked things, that necessarily means that government as such is evil. And that's a conclusion doesn't follow, because yes, it might be true that in many cases positions of authority has been abused, but it doesn't follow that the position of authority itself is bad. The very concept of abuse presupposes that there is some good that is being used against its purpose. So the very concept of abuse implies that there is some legitimate position of authority. So that's also interesting to consider. So yes, then the question becomes, okay, there are these positions of authority, they might be abused, and we know from, you could say, human nature, and there are so many examples of history that human beings can be wicked, they can abuse their authority. There are countless examples of that throughout history. And we could expect that there might be cases in every kind of society. The idea of an earthly utopia where nobody would abuse authority in any way whatsoever. It's impossible here on Earth because human beings have this inclination to do wicked things. And we have abundant examples of that throughout history. So it's something that can happen, and we have to take that into account. And then the question becomes, okay, given this real possibility of abuse, how should we relate to it, and what should we do about this? And this is where, when it comes to the political context, positions of authority in politics, people having positions in government, this is where the question of checks and balances, which you have touched upon earlier, becomes relevant. So this is sort of the basis for such discussions, you could say.
Yes, I think that's a good transition to this point that we wanted to discuss in more detail today. And this is, for me, also one of the core concerns when talking about different forms of government. Is exactly that, that human beings can be wicked or do evil things, as you have said, and everyone has this temptation in him and also succumbs to it from time to time. And so we are in a troublesome position as a society that we need a government to make sure of this common good, namely the peace and order and stability of society, amongst other things, perhaps. And we know also, because of the aspect of evil in human nature, that people in government will be tempted to abuse their position of authority in a way in which to abuse it. And therefore we need to think about if and how we can design a form of government to counteract or to prepare for this case that certain people will become bad, and we need to take this into account and have methods of fixing it, just like perhaps when you have a car and you drive around with it, then you have some tools in your trunk so that when the car has a certain problem, you can fix it and continue to drive. And so these checks and balances, as they are often called, are an important part of every form of government, because if they are designed well, then they will allow this society to function stable for a longer time. Because when it starts to break down in some point, then this can be fixed and continue to function. And one interesting idea in this question that I have just read about this morning by a Greek philosopher by the name of Polybios. He said that many ingenious statesmen have already figured out that the mixed forms of government are more stable than the pure forms of government. Meaning that we have discussed before what a monarchy, what an aristocracy, and what a democracy is. And he said that each of these different forms of government has their own weak spot where it can turn bad. And so if you mix them, then you can keep you can use one of the institutions to keep the other in check. And since there are 3 of them, then you could always, in a good case, have 2 of them being motivated to keep the third in check if it wants to go bad. So that's one thought with which we could start here.
Very interesting points you brought up there, Amos, especially the last point about the idea of there being mixed governments or mixed ways of organizing a society. That you can perhaps have monarchy, aristocracy, and perhaps even democracy, all sort of work together. And that is an idea which I also have thought about and tried to imagine how we could have a well-ordered society with all those 3 ways of organizing. So that's a very, very interesting point. Before I perhaps comment more upon that, there are some, you could say, principles or points to consider concerning the question of how to avoid abuse of authority. And perhaps you could divide it into 2 principles. The first being, are the ways in which we can attempt to make the person having that position of authority avoid abuse or have some incentive or motivation or something which makes him less likely to abuse authority. As I pointed out before, all human beings have this inclination to do bad things, so it's not that we are able to eliminate people's possibility of abusing authority, but are there ways in which we can moderate a person's inclination to abuse? And I think this is an interesting thing to consider, because here we might discuss the role of moral education. That those who will have positions of power are the ways in which we can make sure that those people will have a good moral upbringing and moral education when they learn virtues. They are disciplined or educated to love the good and avoid evil. And I think the Greek philosophers would understand noble or good education in that way. It's making people, training people to love the good and avoiding evil, so that they will have this habit of not wanting to abuse authority, and ways in which those people who will then have positions of authority will be taught the greatness or beauty or goodness of them using authority in a good way. And here I also believe religion plays a huge role in morally motivating people, giving them virtues to rule well. So that's one point. And also the other point is then economic incentives are the way in which we could incentivize those with power to do a good job in ways that it would actually benefit them, not to abuse their authority. That's another interesting point which we could also consider. And then the other principle is, okay, are there ways in which others around that person can make sort of checks and balances, moderate the possibility or their sphere or realm of abuse, so that if we could imagine that the person with authority will do something bad with his authority, are there ways in which the people around could minimize or moderate or regulate that from going too far? And here we might discuss ideas of civil disobedience and other things, customs, rules, etc. So those would perhaps be some guiding principles to have in mind with the idea of moderating or regulating the possibility of abuse itself. And here we could draw in this idea of a mixture of different forms of government and how they can play different roles in the whole societal body, so to speak. What do you think about these considerations?
Yes, also very interesting points that you mentioned here. And I think that's really a relevant question, that because in current thinking, people tend to focus primarily on the division of power, and then also to a large part on the economic incentives perhaps of the people in power, but they neglect almost completely the importance of a good moral upbringing or a good moral character, or as you said, that there are ways that people might learn through life to love that which is good and to hate or despise that which is evil, and to understand really the beauty of being a good moral human being and not just being materially successful. And you mentioned a religion, and I would also mention philosophy, that both of them can be very important in that regard to teach this to a person. And I would also mention in this context that perhaps it's not only about teaching, but also about choosing the right people to be in the right position. So you need a certain the structure of the government should be such that it promotes the best people to the top, and not like in some of our current systems where we sometimes almost feel like the worst people are the ones that are most likely to rise to the top. So because you can say that certain people can be developed by education, but also some people are just perhaps by nature more inclined towards thinking about questions of morality and ethics, and others are perhaps more inclined to just desire power, for example. So I think this would also be an important way of introducing checks and balances to make sure that the process through which someone comes into a position of power is well devised.
Yes, I see your point there. I would add that to the extent there exists some institution or system in a society which might select a candidate suitable for governing a society. This presupposes that we have such a system, perhaps some would say a form of meritocracy, where merit plays a role. And this might be contrasted with the idea of, say, hereditary monarchy, where you inherit the throne, so to speak. So yes, if we consider this way of choosing someone to rule, as you say, it's important to choose someone with the right qualities, with the right virtues. And I would emphasize this point that virtues are essential. And this also, I would say, means that those who would supposedly then be in a position of responsibility in choosing others to govern a society would themselves have to be wise, they would have to be knowledgeable and well educated, so that they can do a good job at identifying good characters, moral characters, persons with great virtues to then rule. And another point, which I would also say, and I think this was something that J.R.R. Tolkien, that famous author behind the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and these famous books, I think he also made a point. Yes, he made a point that those who seek power are the least fit to actually have power. This might also be an irrelevant point, that if you know someone who earnestly seeks to have power over a country, well, that's perhaps not so good, because that sounds like pride, in a sense that he desires to be in that position, so that everyone will see that he has his power, or he will delight in the fact of having power. Rather, we should want someone who has humility, which is very important, and desires the good of his country rather than himself having power. So a love of the nation, or love of the fatherland, to speak in that manner, I think that's very important. to make someone having this mentality of self-sacrifice. That's very important. The willingness to sacrifice your own pleasures and conveniences for the good of the country, and perhaps even in some extreme circumstances, sacrifice your life if it comes to it. That would be truly a virtuous ruler, so to speak. So yes, those are some important things to consider. And yes, as you also agreed to, moral education, moral upbringing, very important values and virtues to consider. And also, yes, religion, philosophy, very important. And also generally the person who governs should have knowledge about the history of that nation. He should have practical knowledge of different subjects and matters. He should have an understanding of human psychology, diplomacy, all those different things that a ruler needs in his life as a governor or a monarch, or at least a political leader, you could say.
Yes, also some good things that you mentioned there. Also this quote by Tolkien, I think that's a very, very true psychological observation, that the person who desires to be in the seat of power is probably not the one that should actually hold it. And I was just thinking now also that perhaps in this thought about what form of government works well to keep abuse of authority in check, we should probably hold the assumption that the majority of people in that society, in the majority of the times, desire the good more strong than the evil. Because if just the entire population turns towards in a bad direction, just desiring their own selfish interest or material gain higher than the good of society as a whole, then I'm not sure if any system in the long run, well, no, that's actually not true what I'm saying now. I think that's where the mixed forms of government would kick in, that you have perhaps a small class or even an individual that can counteract this bad tendency of the majority. So yeah, perhaps that's not true what I said, but I'm wondering just now, how should we proceed? Do you want to go through these different ways of keeping abuse in check? Should we just go through them in sequence, or what would be a good way of going about it?
That's a good question. One possibility is that I might share some thoughts about a way that you could have monarchy, aristocracy, and perhaps some form of democracy mixed together, some ideas about how that could work in practice. So that's one idea, but I'm open for different approaches.
No, I would enjoy that. And then I have written these different points down that we have just made, so I could kind of compare your thoughts to these institutions that we have mentioned, and we will see where it leads us.
Right, yes. I think, interestingly, that a model for some of these ideas of mixing these different forms of government can actually be found in the European Middle Ages. Contrary to what some might believe, the Middle Ages were not, the countries in the Middle Ages did not have absolute monarchies in which the monarch had absolute sovereign power. That rather happened later in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And in the Middle Ages, rather, the form of government was rather very decentralized. You had what is commonly called feudalism. And this though it has been disputed about historians to what extent you can actually call Middle Ages feudalistic. But anyways, you had a system in which, yes, there was a government or there was a king on the throne, and he governed the country as a whole and made national decisions. However, there was an understanding that he was not an absolute monarch. He had to respect other institutions in society which had their own place in the overall direction of society. You had what might be called the vassals, dukes, counts, and forms of military leaders who had jurisdiction, and they had some sort of government over their own local territory or region or province, you might say. And they sort of protected the local population militarily if there were invaders, because back in the day, in the Middle Ages, there was the danger of people from other countries like the Vikings or barbarians who would invade villages and loot and take their stuff, etc. So there was a need for military leaders to protect them militarily from such invaders, and therefore you had this idea of peasants and people and tradesmen and etc. Working in specific regions, and then you had some military leader, knights, and then dukes and counts, etc., who would then protect them militarily, and then they would also have the privilege of ruling. So they would have their position in that way, and you also had some form of democracy even. In France in the Middle Ages, you had people locally who gathered together. They met in some public building in their local area, and then they voted over some practical matters. For instance, if there was a question of building a bridge over a river, they would gather the local community, and then they would decide themselves how they were going to go about doing this. And I imagine that they even had some votes on some of these matters, though I'm not an expert on this. So there was an element of democracy. You had this idea of decentralized rule, where you had all these sorts of different institutions. You also had the church, had a very central role in participating in the direction of society. You had the bishop, the priests, and the pope would also regulate the power of the monarch, and in some cases even excommunicate him or depose him from his throne. So that was also a very interesting check and balance. And today I also thought about generally the role of the nobility. You might imagine the collection of all these military leaders or vassals or regional leaders together forming some sort of nobility class, and they would be some sort of aristocracy. And yes, you would have a monarch who would lead the country nationally, but he would listen to the advice of the nobility, and if the monarch wanted to execute some morally wicked plan, then perhaps the nobility could simply disobey him and thus make his decision null and void. And also, as I said, you had the idea of a tyrannical king who did very wicked things. You could have the Pope who excommunicated him or even deposed him. So that was also another check and balance. So yes, you had these different institutions in society all playing their own role in the participation of the whole system. So I think that the governing philosophy of that age was not that you had sovereignty only located or a state only located in some king, but rather it was overall society to which different institutions participated in their own way. So yes, so those are very interesting ideas to consider that have been historically practiced.
Yes, thank you for this brief overview of this structure of society in Europe in the Middle Ages. I think I took two very things stuck out for me as particularly interesting. One is that the church can actually kind of be seen as a fourth institution of power. So, and if we say that the church kind of stands for the organized form of religion and philosophy in a society, then this is kind of like a fourth separate entity. So we don't only have elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, but perhaps also elements of theocracy, that the organized religion also has an effect on the shape of society or on the government, kind of it interacts there. So I think that's an interesting thought to keep in mind for this process that we are now in of finding good checks and balances. And the other thing that I understood better now, what you meant in previous discussions that we had, that perhaps it might be legal for the dukes or counts to disobey a evil command of the king, but still it wouldn't be legal for them to abolish the king, because if the king has gives a certain order, then one form of checks and balances might be that if the aristocracy as a whole, or as in a large majority, disagree with this order, then they simply don't obey it, and then it just kind of has no effect. But still, the general structure is maintained, because if the king then comes back to his senses and realizes, perhaps this wasn't a good idea, so he gets a little bit humiliated and he comes back with a better thought or more noble order, then the structure will continue because the aristocracy will follow him again. So that's an interesting idea of a checks and balances.
Yes, indeed, a very interesting idea to consider. Now, I might admit, or I can admit, that I don't know of any particular historical examples where the aristocracy did in fact disobey the orders of a monarch, because I haven't investigated historical matters in detail. But I imagine that this could happen, because there was this idea that both the aristocracy and the monarchy had their own role in the overall direction of society. So it's interesting to consider, because the whole notion of state and government was different back then than it is now. We have a tendency to locate authority and the direction of the country in the hands of this modern bureaucratic state, and those are the group of people who have this monopoly on power, and that's sort of the centralized idea of government in the modern era. But back then it was, I suppose, more understood that you rather had the overall society was the body that all of those individual human beings and their families belong to. And then you sort of have a division of labor, where you had all different sorts of institutions playing their own particular role in the overall flow or direction of society. So you had the priests who played their role, and then the bishops and the popes included in that. In society, sort of their religious role. Then you had the knights and the military leaders and the king playing another role. So you sort of have this idea of division of labor. And I think one interesting way to look at it is that there were institutions, traditions, and customs and ways of social organizations that were sort of prior to the will of the state or the king. In modern society, you might think of sort of the state being prior to everything else, and then everything else is after that. That's actually something seems to be more of an idea of modernity. But back then, the monarchy was simply one part of an overall structure which the monarchy belonged to. So it wasn't prior to everything else, but rather there were things that were prior to the will of the monarch, traditions and customs and the natural law. And that sort of puts the order of where everything fits into the whole picture in a different light than it might be today. because one thing that I can also mention that changed historically from the Middle Ages and to the 1700s, where you got more of this absolutist monarchy. For instance, you have Louis XIV in France who said, "I am the state," that famous quote. That was actually a new development that didn't exist in Middle Ages. For instance, you got gradually more and more until the 1600s and 1700s, the idea that the vassals, the military leaders, the regional leaders were determined by the will of the monarch, that it was he who appointed everyone else about who were going to rule this and that region. But if you go further back in time to the Middle Ages, then that wasn't the role of the monarch to do that. The regional leaders had their own sort of tradition that were prior to the monarch. So the monarch couldn't just interfere with that in that radical way. That would actually be him stepping out of his legitimate boundary. So yes, that's an interesting idea to consider, that the idea of absolutism and the idea of sovereignty being located in the hands of one person or a few guys, or the state as this entity that is over everything else, would actually not be the way that the medieval man looked at it. So yeah.
Yes, that's indeed a very interesting thought that you have brought up here. And following, I think, our last conversation, I had some similar thought, because you remember we talked about the notion of elective monarchy, that the people elect the monarch and then the monarch rules the people. And we said that this is kind of seems to be a little bit a confused system, because there isn't clear who actually holds the sovereignty, so who has the last word. And I started to think that perhaps this idea of sovereignty is actually a big problem, and it would actually be very good to have a form of government where every institution, kind of like in a circle, is subject to another institution at least, or perhaps to two others, so that no one institution has the final say, but there is always some institution that can counteract the decision made by this institution. So this has, as I just now realized, the danger that a society could kind of come to a standstill, where always one party blocks the next one from acting in a certain way, but it would at the same time have an effect of checks and balances, that whenever someone wants to decide in a manner that is harmful to the whole, there is some other institution that can hold him back. So I'm not sure how this could be made in detail, but like one idea could be that whenever, no, I will stop at this point.
Right, but yes, you made some good remarks there, and I thought of this one interesting example. It actually comes from an old French song, a French Catholic song about Louis IX, or the famous Catholic monarch Louis of France, who actually became a saint, Saint Louis. There was a song about him where he decided to go on a crusade, and he gathered the military leaders, the vassals, or what you call them, to his, I suppose, royal building, and he asked them who of them wanted to follow him into the crusade and be willing to perhaps sacrifice their own lives in order to protect the Holy Land from the Muslims. And some, at least in the song, some of these knights or military leaders were willing to do so, but others said, no, I would rather be here in France. And the king wouldn't interfere with that. So in other words, whatever you think of the legitimacy of the Crusades, it's an interesting observation that when a king wanted to execute some grand plan, he would actually listen to whether his subordinates, or perhaps even subordinates would be a false word, but those military leaders, those knights or counts or dukes, would be willing to do that with him. And I suspect it was a tradition in the Middle Ages that the king couldn't just command a war from his own throne by himself, isolated from the decisions of anyone else. I think he had to make the other leaders in that country, those military leaders, those knights and dukes, be willing to engage in that war with him. And if they refuse to do so, then, well, he could sort of wage war on by himself, but without the help of the military leaders, it wouldn't really work in practice. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of any historical example which I could say with confidence that here is an example of this happening, but at least in that French medieval song, that sort of balance of powers is reflected. And I think this is very far away from the absolutist power of, say, the modern United States government, where perhaps the president might wage a war through a so-called executive order. In the Middle Ages, it was a different game, in other words. So that's an interesting example to consider. So in other words, it would be said that yes, the king, he was truly the king. He had authority, and he was the leader of the whole country. He was sort of the father to the fatherland, but he couldn't do whatever he wanted. There was a society that was independent of his will, and which he had to respect. And that's an interesting point. And also, just a brief note as well, if you look at some a monarchist movement in Spain in the 19th century, it was called the Carlists, a very conservative Catholic monarchist movement who was reactionary, very against modern liberalism. They supported a traditional Spanish monarchy, but they wanted to limit the power of that monarchy in the way that, for instance, the monarch couldn't interfere with religious affairs. He had to respect the Catholic religion, and he couldn't violate the natural law. So if the monarch wanted to command them to do something against the natural law, then it would be a basis to disobey him, both the regional leaders and the people as a whole. So even those people who were very monarchistic and they were against modern liberal ideas of government, they put very real checks and balances on what the king could and could not do. So it's still a monarchy. It's still a monarchy where the monarch has real political power, but it's not necessarily an absolute monarchy where you can't have any other institution moderating that power, in other words.
Yes, interesting historical examples that you brought up here. I was just now thinking some other point that we have sort of mentioned in the beginning but haven't expanded on yet is the function of religion or culture or tradition itself also as a force. Perhaps we would even have to distinguish between organized religion like the church and the beliefs and traditions and culture of the people as a whole in this society. Because there's an interesting example that Jordan Peterson likes to talk about that was back in the Babylonian Empire. The king was considered to be kind of like they had this religion, and the highest god in their religion was Marduk, who was like kind of a hero that created the world. And he slew a giant monster and created the world out of this monster. And the king kind of had the task to be like Marduk, like this hero of the religion. And always in the new year, they would have this ceremony where the king would kind of be stripped from his kingly clothes and have to confess all the sins he did in the past year, all the ways in which he was not a good Marduk, how he didn't follow this ideal. And then they would have kind of a ceremony, and then the new year would begin. And so these kind of cultural or religious rituals or institutions that the society as a whole just values highly and lives, these can also act as a counterbalance to any one of these institutions that we have mentioned just being able to do what it wants.
Right, to have such traditions and customs, as you say, could be a counterbalance. Now, of course, I would say that paganism is, of course, a false religion and must be opposed. But the point is, as you pointed out, that that's an example of how cultural traditions and perceptions can moderate the power of some institution like the monarchy. And I think that's a very good point. So we could imagine that society has this cultural tradition and perceptions and values and customs set in. It's within the sort of the constitution of society. When I say constitution of society, I'm not meaning the modern liberal idea of constitution where you have a written document like the American Constitution in the 18th century. But the idea here is rather that the society is based upon this foundation that can be religious and cultural and have all these worldviews and perceptions and values and these principles and attitudes by which each individual, each family, each group of people understand each other, they relate to each other and perceive each other to have their own kind of role in the overall societal body. And that's different from the modern notion, where it rather seems that society is sort of a machine and you have this state or government which then administers all these different mechanistic machinations of society according to its will. That is very foreign to the more pre-modern understanding of society. So yes, society would have this unwritten constitution of traditions and customs and religion and culture and all that, which then, say, the monarch has to respect. And if he were to attack those cultural traditions, then it could be perceived that now he's stepping outside of his boundary. The same is true with regional leaders and aristocracies, etc. So yes, you would have society and its nature would precede the will of those in power. So that's a very interesting metaphysical point to consider, that society is not dependent on the will of someone, but precedes the will of someone and all its enriching traditions and culture, if it is good traditions and culture. So yes, that works as a restraining force, and it's sad to see with the dawn of modernity how this have more and more weakened. You can see changes, severe changes in this in the 1500s with the Protestant Revolution, where now instead of the church, instead of Christendom being this this society that transcended the powers of an individual ruler, it was this community of faithful Catholics that was sort of transcending this realm. Now, instead of that, you had in Protestant countries the king nationalizing religion and keeping religion subordinate to his will. And this happened, for instance, here in Norway. Instead of the king being subordinate to this larger realm of Catholic religion, now he centralized religion into his own hands. And now the Lutheran religion, which then became the religion of the state, was now under the king. So the priesthood and everything became localized or became centralized within a state bureaucracy. So this shift in perception of the relationship between politics and religion, that changed a lot, you could say, and that was a huge part in this new modern idea of these things, sadly. So yes, that's an interesting point to consider, and I think this pre-modern understanding of society it's not only is it more true and beautiful, but it's a way of having checks and balances that really work.
Yes, interesting. This whole discussion is very fascinating. I was just thinking right now that perhaps this, which you have described, that in the pre-modern times, that there used to be kind of this worldview or values, attitudes, customs that were kind of just not in a very express, but in a very, they were just part of how people interacted, and people took these things more or less for granted. And perhaps this was the way in which the people influenced the state of affairs, because we have until now talked about the power and position and what the king could do, and we have also talked about the aristocracy and their role and their specific domain of where they actually could decide in their local territories, but the people seem so far almost completely missing in my perception. Only yet they can perhaps vote how a bridge should be constructed or something, but they can't really resist what the aristocracy or the king says. But through these values and customs and traditions, they perhaps have a certain shared expectance of what the king or the aristocracy are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. And then if the king or the duke or someone violates this expectance, which is just kind of, as you said, it's not written explicitly, it's just kind of in people's everyday interaction, they just kind of take this for granted, and then if it is violated, they will revolt, basically, because there were cases of peasant revolts. I think also in the Middle Ages, I have once read about a revolt of German farmers in the year 1525 or something, where they basically went just from one dukeship to the next and kind of destroyed the castle and sometimes killed the duke or plundered his treasury. Or so perhaps that was the way that the population also had an influence on this form of mixed government, if we want to call it like that.
Well, when it comes to the idea of revolt, I think that was rather the exception than the rule. But when it comes to the idea of at least someone stepping outside or interfering with or violating some very deep-seated cultural traditions and customs, that would be considered perhaps even unthinkable. Perhaps it can be compared to some social customs or etiquette or some rules that everyone just implicitly follow when they have certain social interactions with others. And it's not like they have this written down on a paper, but it's very strong rules, and if you sort of don't follow them, then that would be considered extremely weird and inappropriate and perhaps even unthinkable in some cases. That was at least more the case in earlier times. And I imagine that certain leaders, military leaders, and counts and dukes, and also the king, they would sort of understand, they would perceive their own role in society, and they would perceive the important role of institutions and culture and traditions to be so essential that if they were to violate it, it would be unthinkable to them. For them, it would be to completely overstep their boundaries. Perhaps something similar to how unthinkable it would be that if a teacher who worked at school in a classroom just suddenly decided to go to another school and begin to teach the students there purely randomly, it would be considered unthinkable because, no, I'm the teacher of this school. I have nothing to do with that school. And perhaps that's a bad analogy, but the point is that because of their perception of how society worked and how these institutions, what role they had in the metaphysical structure of society, the idea of this absolutism and modern idea of government, it wouldn't be perceived as something that could really be true or good or thinkable, perhaps even, and that's fascinating. There was this other point which I also had, but I think I forgot it now. But yes, at least those things are sort of checks and balances which help to make people respect and not go beyond certain limits. And we talked about earlier moral education, moral upbringing. With this moral education, I think this metaphysical, a specific metaphysical view of society and a particular society's culture and tradition is very important, because if you have this frame of mind where you understand it in this pre-modern way, it would be considered so unthinkable and strange or weird to go beyond certain limits. So that, yeah, and also another thing is also the role of religion, the idea that, well, you could just do whatever you want because there is a God who will be watching over you. I think that also is a powerful point as well. So yes, those perceptions alone constitute a check and balance that many would not perhaps be aware of today.
Yes, again, I think some interesting mention. I hope you can hear me well, because it said my internet is a little bit unstable. So just let me know if you miss something.
Yeah, right now it has frozen up a little bit, your picture, but I think I can hear you well. Right now, yes, it's freezing up the picture, and the quality is a little bit worse. So I hope that will be fixed.
Okay, let's hope it doesn't last for too long. Yeah, so this idea of certain behavior being just unthinkable is an interesting idea, because I think even in our current society, we would have certain forms of behavior also for people in power that would seem to be just unthinkable. But I have a hard time of figuring out an example, because probably it's just, we also live in this certain worldview and have certain customs or ideas. But I would like to try to summarize the different ways of how checks and balances could be instituted, and perhaps we will find that there is one or the other that we want to go into a little bit deeper. So I think we have talked about the division of power to quite an extent, that there might be a good like an aspect of monarchy, an aspect of aristocracy, an aspect of democracy, and also perhaps as a fourth power, the organized religion of the society, kind of having its own role in the process of government. Now, some people have, of course, called the news in our modern times, sometimes the news is called the fourth power. So television and media and newspapers. So perhaps I will just write that down as well. And we have also said that culture hold like as the foundation of their worldview. These are also things that this is actually a separate point that might help to keep abuse of authority in check. And we have also mentioned at some point economic incentives, which we haven't talked about much so far, but which everybody understands quite well what is meant by economic incentives, so that each of these different parts of government could be harmed if they propose an evil course of action and are then stopped by the others, that they will have some economic loss from this proposition. And I think one thing that we have also touched upon is the moral upbringing of people in position of authority, and also that the process by which a successor is chosen should be a wise process. And perhaps here I have one small thought, but I will let you reply and keep the thought for later.
Interesting. Yes, I think you brought up some good points, and I will also make the brief remark that many of the things which we are discussing now could be discussed in greater length, because they're really deep and huge issues and very interesting to consider, especially when we consider history and the historical manifestations of the different forms of system. So these are very interesting topics and could be discussed a lot more, so to speak. But yes, I would say when it comes to the news, that got me thinking about the role of technology in social organization. I think technology and infrastructure play a very huge role in determining the extent to which some particular institution or position or person can have power. Totalitarianism, the idea of one government having a very direct and total control of the whole of society, that is an example of something that was unthinkable in, say, the Middle Ages, because simply the economic and social and cultural structure was such and so decentralized that it would simply be practically impossible, as well as psychologically impossible, because it was unthinkable to have a totalitarian system such as you had with the Western powers during World War I, where you have this war economy, where all parts of the economy were now structured according to the needs of the military, or the fascist government of Italy, or the Nazi government of Germany, or the Soviet Union and China, these communist governments. By the way, it seems like there was a little bit of a problem here, Amos, where you suddenly got out. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll just.
Yes, yes.
Great. It seems like both your video and perhaps sound has frozen.
Oh, my internet.
Yeah, your sound is also very bad, unfortunately. Okay, we'll just be waiting.
I'm just checking. Vielleicht ist das Problem auch bei meinem PC im Fall. Ich tue schnell den PC neu starten. I think I will restart my computer quickly. Perhaps it will be better then, because it's, oh no, now it's getting a little bit better, it seems. We can try. If it doesn't get better, then I will restart my computer.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I can hear you well, and your video is working. Only thing is that your video quality is reduced, but it's workable.
Okay, so I heard you said that something like the totalitarian form of government was unthinkable in the Middle Ages because the technology was missing. And then it's on the thought, and then we can cut it.
Right. Yeah. So I can repeat the point that we have discussed how the perceptions of the pre-modern era was such that it was unthinkable, at least as I understand it, that you can have a very totalitarian, absolute statist system. And also, in addition to that, we also know that the technology back in the pre-modern era, especially in the Middle Ages, as well as the infrastructure and all that, they were such that it was simply impossible to have anything like, say, the war economy of the Western powers in the World War I era, or the fascist government of Italy, or Nazi government in Germany, or the Soviet communist government in the 20th century. Were simply unthinkable, because the society was so decentralized. It would be impossible to have anything like that. And I thought of that when you mentioned the news, because that's another thing. Before the modern era, news were far more difficult to, you could say, spread around to the people. You didn't have all these things with television and radio and cell phones and now internet, which spread news rapidly. So that also made it very difficult to spread propaganda, for instance, because it was practically very, very difficult to have this huge scheme to convince a lot of people to support some program or idea. It began to change somewhat with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. And that's why you, for instance, saw that the Protestant Revolution began to spread rapidly, because they wrote so many booklets and books and pamphlets attacking Catholicism and spreading this new religion. But before that, the way you were going to communicate with people were either to meet them physically or write letters at hand, for hand, and then you have to send it. And then people have to use a horse and carriage or walk by foot or something like that in order to get to another place. So this, you could say, level of decentralization made it very difficult to have all these very modern statist political programs. Just take the modern political campaigns. Every time there's an election in Western countries, say the United States, there's this huge program where, you know, presidential candidates, they go all across the different states, and they have all these speeches, and they perhaps write books and a lot of presidential debates on TV. Those things would be impossible, literally, if you go back far enough in time. So that's also an important point. Infrastructure, technology, communication, and these things influence things like the news and propaganda and ways you can execute plans, etc. So that's also a very interesting point to consider as well.
Yes, that is indeed an interesting point that you brought up here, and it's also telling for the human nature that as soon as it was possible, also it started to be done, this totalitarian form of government. So there is really something to be said, even to have some technological difficulties, because that not only it makes some aspects of life perhaps more difficult in day-to-day life, but it's also kind of a protection against possible evils, because it just simply cannot be done. So I think that's well pointed out of you, that actually technology changes, in a sense, the environment in which all of these institutions in society then exist. And that means with different technology, perhaps also different forms of government are needed, because now there are new ways of abuse, and then also you need new checks and balances to keep that abuse in check or to counteract it. So I think that's interesting. I was also thinking that about this process of choosing a successor, which I think is a very important aspect in any form of government, or also in a mixed form of government. And I would maintain as a general rule that each institution should be able to choose its successor by itself. So, or at least, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems to me that what you mentioned, for example, when the king decided who was going to be part of the aristocracy, then the state very quickly turned into an absolute monarchy. So it seems to me that the king should be able to choose his own successor without hindrance by the people or the aristocracy. And the aristocracy should be able to renew itself without hindrance by the other ones. And also the people should be able to, well, they basically just renew themselves by existing, but so there the problem doesn't really arise. But I think when one party can decide who is going to be in the seat of authority of the other party, then there is no longer really a division of power. Then there is just one party basically deciding everything really soon.
Interesting points you brought up there, especially the idea of an institution choosing a new successor internally. So it's an internal decision. I think that makes a lot of sense. I am reminded now of just the norm of patriarchy and patriarchal families, where you have a family and it's led by a patriarch, and then you will have successors to that patriarch, but it all happens within that family. It's not like something beyond that specific patriarchal family chooses the new patriarch. It's usually the son or something like that who takes over, and that makes sense. So now this perhaps touches upon the question of well, how should certain leaders be chosen? Yes, it should be chosen internally. So when it comes to, say, an aristocracy, say you have a nobility, in the model which I presented that were practiced in the Middle Ages, nobility or the aristocracy were more or less the collection of all these military leaders or counts or dukes that controlled these regions and protected the people militarily and things like that. So I suppose then the leader of such a region would choose some successor to take over for him. That's a possibility. So perhaps you can imagine that happening in monarchy, where you have the monarch choosing someone else to be his successor. And the benefit with that would be that the monarch has all this experience and knowledge and virtue in ruling the country. So he would be well suited to choose someone whom he thinks would be able to take over for him. He will be equipped to make that decision. Now, I would argue that it would make sense to have a hereditary monarchy, where the monarch, when a monarch passes away, it is the son who takes over. And one of the reasons I believe this would be a very good system is that where you have a monarchical family or a royal family, I think that's very beneficial, because that royal family will grow up with all these attitudes and habits and experience and obtain virtues that are specific to monarchy and ruling a country. So when you have a king and he has a family, there's a queen and there are sons and daughters, then the king can then raise his son to become the successor. And since he has this biological familial relationship to that son, he can now teach the son how to become his successor in a way that he never could do to a stranger, which he would appoint if it were not his own son. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have the father teach his own son how to become a great monarch, and teach him the virtues and all the experience he had and the knowledge gradually as the son becomes older and goes eventually from being prince to monarch. And also this is what is practiced very often throughout history. So I think this would be a good way to have succession. And also another benefit is that you avoid the problem of those seeking power for its own sake, as we discussed earlier. We should avoid choosing people who seek to become leaders to actually be leaders, because one could suspect that he desires powers for its own sake, and that's pride, that's desires and selfish ideas that are not meant to be good. They are not good virtues to have in a monarch. But if you have someone who inherits the throne, then he wouldn't seek the throne, but rather it will be given to him. So you avoid that problem as well. So yes, we might have some disagreement about that specific issue, but at least now I presented some arguments in favor of that. And yeah.
Yes, no, I mean, it is an interesting question, but I would actually just at the moment, I am convinced of exactly the opposite, that it would be better to specifically have not a hereditary monarchy, because I think the fact that a person will inherit the throne doesn't necessarily avoid him being very hungry for power or having an evil character or desiring that power. And we can see that also, that there were many intrigues and murders in royal families where one person who was not the first successor to the throne tried to get rid of that one before him, or two sons or cousins got into strife and into civil war. And so I think that this is a big problem, but perhaps also I have these examples in mind from other monarchies than the one you are talking about from the Middle Ages, because as we said, there was absolutist monarchy and there was monarchies that were more kept in check by other institutions. But I was actually thinking that I really like the idea that was popular in the so-called 5 great emperors of the Roman Empire, where it was custom that the emperor would adopt a young boy, basically, or a kind of a boy, who he thought has superior virtue just kind of by nature. So his character was above average in virtues already, and then he would adopt this boy as his son and raise him to be the successor. And I like this idea much better, because children can vary from their parents, and sometimes a very thorough and a person who is very dedicated to the common good can still have a son who will be kind of lazy and egoistic or power hungry, etc. So I think that's why I like the other idea better. And also in that case, it would be that the successor has not sought the throne actively, but he was chosen by observers just because of his good conduct generally in life. And I think that's a better solution.
Well, these are various points that could be discussed more at length, but there's one point which I think is interesting to consider, and this I got from this German economist, or actually is educated in philosophy, Hans Hermann Hoppe. Now, Hoppe, he's actually a libertarian, but he has argued that from an economic perspective and perspective of incentives and things like that, it makes more sense to have a monarchy compared to a democracy. And he makes various arguments. And one of the arguments is that true, in a monarchy, you could most certainly have bad kings. That's very true. And there are many examples of in history of bad and even tyrannical kings. But when it comes to, say, democracy, he argues that it's actually, the thing is, in a monarchy, you could have bad leaders, but you could also have good kings. But in his view, in democratic elections, you will necessarily have bad leaders, because in democratic elections, those who acquire power will acquire power because they have sought it. They have sought it and campaigned for it and persuaded people to vote for him. And therefore, you will necessarily have people in power who have sought power and have this, therefore, proudful character, according to him. And that's an interesting point. And I would also say that when you look at history, it's true that you have had very bad kings, and it could be, as you say, murders within a royal family and strife and even war. But that's also true for democracies and other non-monarchical forms. If you look at the 20th century, it has been very bloody and destructive. And also just the United States with the Civil War in the 19th century and huge problems with trying to impose democracy in Latin America or in Africa have been disastrous, to put it that way. So yeah, I would say you could find good and bad examples on both sides, or perhaps you could argue that in democracies, you can suspect whether you actually can get good forms of democracies in the way it's practiced in the modern era. Perhaps that's a separate point, but I would say still it makes more sense to have a monarch who raises his own son to become the monarch, because the father knows his own son better than he knows others, and he would be better, much more able to teach him the ways of being a good king compared to teaching or appointing others. It's very true that you could have a good father but a bad son, but at least a good father would be in a position to do his best to teach his son to become a good king, and perhaps discipline him if it's necessary, and teach him virtues and educate him and all that. So I think that's a very reasonable and good way to try to make good kings. In other words, of course, you would have bad kings in that system too, but it's at least a system that could, to a large extent, help to regulate the behavior of the successor of the current king. So yes, and also this is more of a general point where we are considering and comparing different forms of government. When we consider possible bad outcomes of one form of government, we also have to keep in mind the extent to which there can be also very bad forms of government in these other cases. So just as there are bad hereditary monarchies, there can be bad elective monarchies and bad aristocracies and bad democracies. So we have to also keep that in mind. We have made this point before, but this is a generally good point to repeat it again, that there can be good and bad forms of government of all forms, and good sides and bad sides. So that's also something to remember.
Yes, that is of course true. I would still disagree that that it's necessary that hereditariness in general, I think, is not a very good way of getting a successor to any position, but it should be based on merit in some way. But I think we disagree on this point, but it's more of, it's at least what we have agreed on is that the process by which a successor to a certain position of authority is to be found, that process can also act as a check or balance of power. How it should be made up in detail, I think we cannot agree or find a solution in this particular conversation. Perhaps we can get into more detail on that in another one. But as you also mentioned correctly, that the good moral upbringing of the successor is, of course, very closely related with the process by which the successor is to be determined. So these two are kind of very close together. And then we had the economic incentives, as we have mentioned already, and we had the division of power between different institutions in society, and each institution having its own system of making sure that a good successor should come in the step of the one holding the authority at the moment. And we had the culture and tradition and general values of society. And I just had another thought also, that not only should these, when we say we have a division of power, that not only should these different institutions have their own way of defining their successorship, but they should also be independent in financing themselves from each other. They should really be completely independent institutions in society that are therefore not dependent on the other institutions. And this might be difficult in practice how this should be done in each case, but I think in general it's very important, because as soon as one institution is kind of in some form dependent, or if there is not a balance of dependence between them, but one has kind of more influence over the other than the other way around, then it will all gravitate towards just either being a pure monarchy or a pure aristocracy or a pure theocracy or democracy or something like that.
Interesting points you made there, and also yes, to the last point you made. I think that's a very good thing to consider, to have this independence and autonomy also in, at least to some degree, financial matters. And when it comes to division of power, many people might be aware of the ideas of Montesquieu, that philosopher of the 18th century, who made this division in government between the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power, to sort of avoid tyranny. However, the problem is all those powers are within one government structure, and they are actually sort of one entity. There are three divisions within one entity. And it seems to me that, well, what prevents those three powers from sort of going together and forming some sort of governmental cartel? There's nothing intrinsic in that to prevent it. So I would say that no, that the idea of Montesquieu doesn't really work, I fear. And it would make more sense that instead of having subdivisions within one entity, that is the government, rather have different entities that are not simply divisions within government, but rather entities within the overall system or overall society. In other words, I think that makes much better sense, and it helps to both psychologically and in reality prevent totalitarianism. It prevents the idea that there is this one government structure which has everything by its hand, so to speak, but it's rather a huge order of various institutions and organs, each playing their own role. And the idea of one institution taking over for the others become then unthinkable. I think just to have that perception is very important to avoid many problems that we have with the big government statism of today. So I think this is a good way to end the conversation. If that's okay with you, or unless there is some other remark you want to touch upon.
No, I just wanted to agree with your last statement, and I think it would be an interesting exercise because you said that it is better to have truly different entities in society with a distinct role than have just one entity which is subdivided into three parts, because I agree that the legislative, executive, and judicative are growing together, and that is a problem in our current democracies. And the point I would be interested to pursue further is what might very characteristic tasks in a society be that could warrant to have truly independent entities in that society that would then together by cooperation make up the whole. So what specific common goods are important and distinct enough to merit an own institution, and then these different institutions together would kind of make up the government of the society?
That's a very, very good question. And that is something I would love to think about, reflect more about, and possibly come up with some good answers. I think one approach to consider is trying to find out the basis of society. It reminds me a bit of what Plato did in the Republic. He began to make the basis of, well, what is what is society about? Well, it goes to the basis. Okay, we have the individual, but the individual needs the others to cooperate economically, and therefore you need this amount of trade and this amount of cooperation. From that, you need a military class to protect them from foreign enemies. So you can sort of imagine the structure of society in that way. But I think also to practically look at history and perhaps look at society today, to examine and find out, well, how does the social don't want to use the word of mechanism, because I think society is an organic entity rather than a mechanistic machine. That's another very modern error and dangerous error, to consider it a machine. To find out what is the nature and essence of society, what are those common goods, and thereby we can better examine and understand how institutions play this and that role, and help to find out how society could in fact be better. So yes, those are very interesting questions, and this might be something we can return to in later conversations as well. So yes, to summarize what we have been discussing so far, we have been discussing the abuse of power or authority, what that is, and ways to moderate that. We have been discussing different principles that we have first trying to motivate the one having power to not abuse it to the extent it's possible, and checks and balances generally in society. We have discussed monarchy, aristocracy, the democracy, and we have discussed ways they can be mixed into one way of organizing society. We have been discussing examples from the Middle Ages and comparing that with the absolutist age of the 17th and 18th century and modernity, the modern era. We have been discussing hereditary monarchy versus other approaches to find successors to ruling a country, and different perceptions of how society works, the metaphysical basis of society, the relationship between politics and customs and traditions and religion in society. I think this has been very interesting, valuable, very productive to discuss, and I thank you, Amos, for joining me on discussing this matter in this conversation. And I hope the audience found this interesting as well. So I'll then end with wishing both you, Amos, and the audience a great Friday and great weekend. And I will let you have the last word.
Yes, it was my pleasure. It was indeed also for myself an interesting and productive conversation. And I think it has moved my understanding another step forward. And I'm also really interested in continuing this conversation and perhaps see what specific institutions should be kind of like the organs of a society, if you want to use that analogy of an organism. So yes, it was interesting and valuable, and I wish you and the audience a great weekend as well.
Thank you. Okay, goodbye everyone.
Goodbye.